Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Book Talk. I am Kristina Tanasichuk, the executive editor of Homeland Security Today, and I am very, very excited today because we have something very special. We have a book talk with two authors about two interrelated but different books. So I'm very excited to welcome Ajit Maan, who's the author of Narrative Strategies, the second edition, and Scott Mann, the author of Nobody is Coming to Save You. Welcome to you both.
Thanks. Thanks for having
Absolutely. So Ajit has been working with HS Today for quite a while. She's actually our managing editor for narrative strategy, and she is an internationally recognized security and defense analyst and narrative strategist. In the 1990s, she developed the groundbreaking theory of internarrative identity, a roadmap for resilient identity created out of personal and cultural conflict. Her work has far-reaching implications for conflict resolution and community engagement in hostile environments. So very, very timely today. She has done a tremendous amount of work in this topic. Dr. Mann's research and her books, such as Counterterrorism, Narrative Strategies, Soft Power on Hard Problems, and Narrative Warfare, focus on deconstructing dominant and coercive narratives. So she has been very busy, especially recently, given such a, well, you'll hear in a bit, such a war that we're having in narrative strategy. And Scott Mann, who's the author of Nobody's Coming to Save You, and hopefully you see both books right there. Please do go to Amazon and buy them if you want to be smart about any of these topics. Scott Mann is a husband and dad. He's also a retired Army Green Beret. So while serving in the Army, Scott has traveled throughout the world, some of the deployments, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, Panama, Peru, and Ecuador. So after retiring from the Army, Scott founded the Hero's Journey, a nonprofit organization that helps warriors and their families find their voice and tell their story as they come home from military service. So he came back, and not only did he found a nonprofit, but he also decided he needed to write a book. So he learned that the best way to get, well, big shit done. Ooh, can I say that? It's our video, I guess. And bridge vast divisions is to meet people where they are and not where you want them to be. He calls this approach rooftop leadership. So his book is focused on the social trends and fraying of civil society. And after more than 2 years of prolonged isolation from COVID, mass technology, organizational strain, and blinking red stress levels, our emotional dashboards have taken a toll that those of us in our own exhausted majority are only beginning to understand. So, with that, I'm very excited to welcome you both and ask why you wanted to do this interview together.
Thanks, Kristina, for having us. I invited Scott to join me on this book talk because we are centrally concerned about storytelling and narrative competence in the threat environment today. I think we both agree that we are in narrative warfare. Though we come from such divergent perspectives, I'm an academic, Scott's a former Green Beret, we appreciate the role that narrative plays in holding cultures together. And we are very concerned that our American narrative is being eroded by our adversaries. And we're concerned that we don't seem to know what to do about it. So that's what we'd like to discuss.
Yeah, and I think for me, just to pile on what Ajit just said, it's really also that I feel like as a almost as a species, we've lost our conscious connection to the power of story. Dr. Ivan Tyrrell says that the brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ, and it really is. It uses story to make sense of the world, and it's as if we've just collectively and individually devalued story's role in sense making, and that's not a good place to be as a civil society.
Absolutely. I don't think many people even view it that way. They don't look at the importance of story at all. So tell us more about really narrative strategies versus narrative warfare. Talk to us a little bit about what that is and what that means for society, because we certainly don't think of ourselves in a war.
Well, we are in one. And our adversaries have made it very clear that that's how they intend to play. They don't want to have a kinetic conflict if they don't have to, or prefer not to. They, winning without fighting is the concept. So a narrative warfare is what is happening. It's an erosion of our narratives through many cuts from many directions by many adversaries. It's an erosion from within. It's an erosion of our identity as a country, as a culture, and what holds us together. Narratives, let me just make a distinction between narrative and storytelling. A narrative is the way, it's a historical, cultural thing. It's a way that a culture understands itself and the meaning of its environment, identity within that environment. Storytelling is what we hear all the time. It's the way that we talk about that narrative. The narrative part isn't something we talk about very often. It's less than conscious, but storytelling is highly conscious, and our brains are so receptive to storytelling. And storytelling connects our lived everyday experience up with the way our culture has historically understood itself. So, for example, and if we don't have that kind of connection, we're destabilized. So if people's everyday experience does not jive with the Constitution or with whatever their cultural narrative is in any country, then you have the incredible potential for instability. And what we need storytelling to do is tell people what they're experiencing right now and help them tell their own stories about what they're experiencing right now in a way that connects it with the narrative, with the way we have as a society historically understood ourselves.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add, because Jeet always frames it so beautifully, Kristina, is one of the things that I talked about in my book is I kind of break it down as a former Green Beret. We go into places and we work by, with, and through indigenous cultures to help them stand up on their own. We're very different than Navy SEALs and Delta Force in that everything that we do is by, with, and through indigenous partners. We go in with 12, we come out with 1,200, and most of that is through old school interpersonal skills. I call them the Lawrenceian skills, but it really is. And narrative and storytelling is at the heart of that. And the phrase that I use to describe it is narrative competence. Is the application of purposeful storytelling in real time to meet your goals and the goals of the other party. And one of the things I'm really concerned about, as Ajit talked about, is we've lost, I believe, our competency around narrative and storytelling. We, institutionally, I mean, whether it's DoD, policy circles, everywhere I look, I just see deficits in narrative competence, and that really concerns me, because if you look at the adversaries that we're facing right now, be they state or non-state actors, they are very much on their game with narrative competence, and they are bringing it in a very big way, and we're completely asleep at the switch.
So did we ever have narrative competence? And if we did, why did we lose it?
You want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we have at times. I've seen it brilliantly demonstrated, at least in special ops, in special forces. I've seen episodic examples of it. I'll give you one. During Operation Just Cause, when we invaded Panama, there were thousands and thousands of Panamanian defense forces that were left over after we initially seized the capital of Panama City. And they all fled to the rural areas, the jungles of Panama. And it was going to be a very ugly cleanup situation. Several of the special forces units that were on the ground that actually lived in Panama and were stationed there during the invasion, they went to the Central Command element and said, hey, this is going to, if we go in and do a clearing operation, we're going to spend the next 50 years trying to restore some kind of stability in this country. And it's going to be an ugly cleanup. Give us half a day and we can affect the surrender of these folks. And so what they ended up doing, they called it Operation Ma Bell. But these various Green Beret units flew to the regional areas, dropped in with like 10 soldiers, put, there was no cell phones back then, put dimes in the local payphones, called the comandancias up in Spanish, and basically just had conversations with them about what was going on at a narrative level, like what this was really happening and what the outcomes were going to be if they did this or if they did that. And in every single one of those situations, they affected the surrender of the entire Panamanian Defense Forces without a shot fired. And, that is buried in the annals of special operations history. But to me, it's endemic of the fact that there are times when we understand the power of narrative, the power of active storytelling in real time, and we can elect to go there even in a very kinetic environment. And there's a lot of examples of that. The problem is, to your question, I don't know that we've ever demonstrated it in a systemic way where we're just collectively conscious about it all the time. It's always been something I think we've kind of been lacking in.
Did you want to add, Gigi? Did you want to add to
Well,
that?
I agree. And I appreciate the example. Let me give an example that most people can relate to. We're dealing with a huge amount of disinformation. And we hear that term all the time, disinformation and misinformation. And our knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, let's tell the truth. Let's tell the facts. And while there's certainly nothing wrong with truth or facts, it's how you tell it. We have to tell it in such a way that is received by, other people. And that's not in bullet points. So, just throwing facts at people, they don't know what to do with that. What we need to do is storify those facts, tell a story that gives meaning to the facts. And so people talk about information warfare. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the meaning of the information and conflict over who gets to decide that meaning. That's what narrative warfare is. It's not about the information, it's about the meaning of it and the decider of it.
And, to that point too, and this is something I talk a lot about in my book, is again, narrative competence. It's not just the design of the narrative. It's not just the design of the stories. It's in the delivery of the stories as well. And, Dr. Kendall Haven in Story Proof, he talks about how the brain has a make sense mandate. It has a mandate to make sense of the world. And, story just by definition does that when it's well designed and when it's well told. And, that's another area. If you watch senior leaders today, they are absolutely, and this is in corporate America too, absolutely terrible at telling stories, at delivering stories in a way that actually lands with the audience, that actually lands with the listener. Everything is bulletized. Everything is short form. Everything is so PowerPoint heavy. And all that's really doing is engaging working memory. Stories, one of the beautiful things about stories is they engage long-term memory. When I teach, I use almost no PowerPoint, and I can tell a story like the Operation Ma Bell story. I could go back 6 hours later in a full day workshop and ask the audience, what was the name of the operation that took place? And every single person in there would remember it, even though it's not endemic to, the central theme of the story. And that's another thing about this, is that the skill set in delivering stories has atrophied so poorly that, people are switching to their phones, even when their CEO or the undersecretary is in front of them. They'll be on their phones in 6 seconds under the table because the leadership just cannot hold a room in any capacity with narrative.
Absolutely. I actually see it every day, and I connect it to the fact that people talk about bullets, like you say, rather than the mission of why they're talking. And oftentimes, if you approach it from, well, the mission is to save children, or the mission is to do something that evokes passion in people, and bullet points don't. So I completely understand. So when you say the word story, many people think, well, does that mean that it's made up or untrue? So can you talk a little bit about how stories can be real and meaningful, and be true?
Do you want to go, Gigi?
Sure. And there are, of course, fictional stories. But we need to get our definitions clear. I think story, and we're defining the difference between narrative and storytelling. Narrative is that big meta thing, and storytelling is the specific micro telling. And yeah, I mean, we in our culture right now, we're confusing things like disinformation and propaganda and all that kind of stuff. There can be that sort of fictional thing, but stories are what you and I tell all the time. It's what we heard from our grandparents. It's how historically knowledge is passed on from a people to a people. So, you know, I don't quite know how to dispel that other than by having conversations like this and telling stories that are factual enough. They're just stories, and they're not bullet points, and they're not lists of facts like grocery shopping. We are still getting factual information across, but it's in a way that delivers what it means, what all that means to
Yeah.
the audience.
There was a study that Dr. Haven talked about where um, that just measuring brain activity during storytelling, and one of the things that we know is that the brain tells itself a story when it's presented with factual data. It forms a story to make sense of it, and it filters it, right? So there's filtering. So the listener is telling themselves a story anyway. And what we've seen most of the time, if you present factual data and that's all you do, if you just hit with facts all the time, is that the listener is going to probably get a good chunk of it wrong because that they're having to form their own narrative to make sense of it. The brain doesn't just take the data and process it in raw form. It has to do its own filtering through narrative and story, through story. And then the other thing is that it is, the brain has a mandate to conserve as much energy as possible, and so there's going to be a level of agitation in the listener if they're constantly having if they're having to tell themselves a story to make sense of your data. And so to Gigi's point about storifying data, I mean, by simply couching your ideas in the vehicle of a story and understanding just the architecture of a story and understanding certain principles too in storytelling. And I found this, I speak on all kinds of stages, from tech to medical to national security, intelligence. And I think Dr. Carl Rogers is exactly right across the board. What's personal is universal. I can go into any of those forums and I can tell a story that is personal to me, but has universality to it. And within that, the sense making mechanisms of my audience, they'll autobiographically listen to that, and they'll make sense of it in their own lived experience. And I think that's one of the coolest things about narrative competence is this aspect of autobiographical listening, where my father's battle with cancer or my experience as a Green Beret dealing with villagers in Afghanistan and what we learned about the importance of going local and understanding local culture there. A police officer in San Francisco can listen to that and autobiographically make sense of how community policing would work for him.
Absolutely. So I don't want to have you give your entire books away. We want you, our readers, to go buy Nobody's Coming to Save You and to buy Narrative Strategies, second edition. So I will ask this question, and you can add as much as you want, but we don't want to give it all away. What would your advice for leadership that's looking to instill more of this storytelling to their communications so that their employees will pay more attention, but so their employees will remember, or so that really for our government to be able to make these arguments better and in a better way. I think that, working with DHS for a very long time, I think they could use some advice on storytelling and how that connects to mission. Certainly DoD, explaining their missions to the public is a very difficult and challenging thing. So where would leaders start?
I'll jump in and
Yeah, go ahead.
So a couple of things that I would say, and these are the same things that when I'm teaching at in the special forces course or federal law enforcement or corporate America, I think there's just a couple of things that I would say on the narrative front. Number one is I think that understanding that what's personal is universal. People are hungry for leaders who can share stories that have personal dynamics to them, um, because it makes you immediately relatable in a period of low trust. Storytelling is a trust accelerant. If you're willing to, I call it the generosity of scars, but to integrate elements of that have personal nature to them. I'm not talking about a therapy session in front of your people, but I am talking about being authentic and relating personal experiences within your storytelling, regardless of your station in life. People are starving for that. The second thing that I would throw out there is that leaders should really have a backstory. You should have a signature story that you build around a pivotal moment in your life of that would, if you were to talk about that pivotal moment that happened to you and the struggle that ensued and how you overcame it, it would give us a sense of who you are. An 8 to 10 minute backstory of where you've been, where you are, and where you're going is a really powerful thing for leaders to have. And the final thing that I would say in terms of narrative competence in this low trust environment that we live in and where our enemies are flanking us left and right, I believe that often it's not the stories that we tell, Kristina, it's the stories we ask to hear. Leaders who can ask thoughtful, open-ended questions that allow the other party to respond in narrative and who actually value the response to come back in that way, they're the ones who are going to have better context. They're going to have better situational understanding, and they're frankly going to have a better emotional connection to the people they serve. Rather than asking yes or no questions, close-ended questions, let's get in the habit of questionology, where we ask questions, let the other party respond back in story. Takes a little longer, but I think in this age of complexity, it's super powerful.
Agreed. And I would just simply add that there's nothing newfangled about this. This is not a night, there's nothing really new to learn. It's about remembering. It's about taking time, getting back to who we are. Our brains are wired for this. Yeah. We want to tell stories. We want to hear stories. We crave it. We are meaning-seeking creatures, and that's what stories tell us. They tell us the meaning and why, not just abstractly, but what does it mean for me and mine? What does it mean for you? What's the meaning of all this? It's as old as human beings, this practice. So it's just about getting back to that innate knowledge and that thing that our brains just do.
And everything in modern society conditions us not to do what Gigi just said. That's the rub, is that everything around us tells us not to do that. Nobody wants to hear your story. No one has time to hear your story. Just do bullet points. Everything about our modernity moves us away from what Gigi just said, and it moves us away from our truth. It moves us away from connection. It moves us away from reciprocity. All the things that we need as a functioning liberal democracy, it moves us away from. And so we almost have to go against the trends. We have to go against what everybody else is doing and invest in that narrative competence and in that story muscle, because that's the only way I think that you can really move people. And I've seen it in combat multiple times. The leaders that I would follow to hell and back were the storytellers.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. That's so true. And looking at kind of what you say is our modernity, we do have several avenues where authenticity and storytelling are gaining tremendous numbers of followers. So if you're on TikTok, I know you're both not, it's not a good thing. TikTok bad, but TikTok does have speakers and certainly influencers who are having people follow them based on their story. And of course, now there are reels on Facebook and all of those clips and people who are sharing their personal journeys. So you see that kind of authentic storytelling, when it's authentic, sometimes you find out it's a load of you know what. But for the most part, you see that people are drawn to that. So can you talk a little bit about kind of that role of social media, but in particular in the context of the storms that we've seen in Florida? So we've seen two storms come through, and FEMA is buried in mis and disinformation. How do leaders deal with that? I mean, that is a gossip mill run amok because you can share something and people share it, it's all over the place. How do leaders get a handle on something like these disasters in Florida?
Go ahead, Gigi. I'll jump in after you.
Well, there's a problem with trust in the first place. So it's hard to catch up when you're not there, at the beginning. It's anytime you're telling a story, anytime you want to have influence, you want to get there first, and you want to frame for the audience the information they're about to receive, whether from you or elsewhere. So catching up is a hard thing. Establishing trust in the first place is the way to go. If you don't get there first and you are in a position that you have to catch up and there has been disinformation already spread, my suggestion would be not to address it because you're elevating that disinformation. You're legitimizing it by repeating it. So I would say, tell your story. Don't look back. Tell your story. Establish the trust you can manage to establish at the moment.
Yeah, that's so good. We stood up a veteran network called Task Force Pineapple during the Afghanistan withdrawal that helped evacuate our allies out of Afghanistan during the collapse. And then we've stood that network up other times. It's just veterans from across the country, and we can mobilize our resources pretty fast. And we did it for the fires in Maui. We've stood it up for Ukraine. And most recently in Appalachia, that's where my family's from. And then my dad was an incident command firefighter. And so I have a really vested interest in what's going on in Western North Carolina. And what I can tell you is Gigi is absolutely right. There is already a pre-existing trust gap between institutions and people of Appalachia. They're very similar in some ways to Pashtuns in Afghanistan. They're far removed from the centrality of government in many ways. And so that's just a natural thing that you have. But then you take this diabolical flood that happened and just the horrific carnage that came with that. And then the very slow response that followed for a range of reasons. I mean, and again, I know a lot of these firefighters and FEMA individuals, and a lot of them are really good people that had a range of factors pressing on them. But what didn't happen was, as that gap continued in relief and more locals dealt with the problem than federal, the narrative really took off that the central government didn't care and that they weren't interested in a bunch of hillbillies in Appalachia. And, at least that was one narrative that really took root in those mountains. And it was one of the things that I advised a lot of folks in the federal government. I said to them, if you're going to get back in there, you have some work to do. You have some serious work to do to reestablish trust in these at-risk areas. And you're going to have to get seriously local. And as Gigi said, you're going to have to tell your story, but you're also going to have to hear a lot of stories. And they're probably not going to be very pleasant when you hear them, But I don't see much narrative exchange happening at a local level right now in that situation. And that seems really important to me.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're seeing is stories on Facebook just reinforcing certain mis or disinformation. But some people haven't seen help and some people have. And so it's hard to discern, but I don't want to give any more away. So I want to thank you both so much for your time. This has been terrific. Again, we encourage you to go to Amazon or your bookstore or wherever you need to go to buy Nobody's Coming to Save You, and certainly Narrative Strategies. So thank you all for joining us for this book talk. And thank you both for your time.
Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Kristina.